Imagine boarding a plane for an important flight, holding a first-class ticket, your hard-earned seat in a world that's supposed to welcome you. But instead of a warm greeting, you face doubt, suspicion, and rejection. This isn't just any passenger. This is Malcolm Avery, a calm, powerful CEO, flying undercover to see if his company's new airline truly respects dignity and equality. What happens when the people meant to serve and protect show bias masked behind polite smiles and company policy? How does a man respond when his rightful place is denied? Not because of error, but because of assumptions rooted in race and appearance. This story isn't just about one man or one flight. It's a mirror held up to all of us, a question about how we judge others and what we owe each other as human beings. Will Malcolm's silence break the cycle of discrimination, or will it become just another unheard voice lost in the crowd? Stay with us as we unravel this powerful journey of quiet resistance, dignity, and change. If you believe in justice and respect, hit like, share this story, and subscribe to the channel. Let's dive in. The rain hadn't let up since 5 a.m. It fell in quiet sheets against the glass facade of Atlanta Hartsfield's Terminal 4, wrapping the runway in a silvery haze. Inside Gate C-12, the world was waking slowly, not with energy, but with a kind of sluggish compliance. People yawned. A woman in scrubs clutched a coffee too hot to sip. A couple argued in whispers about overhead bin space. A toddler threw animal crackers on the floor, one by one. Malcolm Avery stood near the corner window, half-shadowed, a man designed to be overlooked if he wanted. And this morning, he did. He wore a simple olive hoodie, well-worn khaki slacks, and clean, white sneakers. His hands were tucked into the pockets of his jacket, except when one emerged to flip the page of a dog-eared copy of Scientific American. Slung over his shoulder was a brown leather duffel, aged but neat. Nothing screamed power, or wealth, or ownership, only presence. He didn't wear a watch. He didn't carry a briefcase. He didn't need to. The stillness around him told its own story. Flight 932 to New York City. On time, Nova Air. Malcolm glanced up at the screen again. A subtle smile tugged at the edge of his mouth. Punctuality was a good omen. Or maybe just a pleasant surprise. From behind the counter, Brooke Halter adjusted her navy blazer and glanced at her tablet. Her posture was polished, her hair pulled tight into a bun, but the tight line of her jaw said she'd rather be anywhere else. She scanned the crowd, her gaze lingering on suits and heels, polished briefcases and AirPods. She smiled at a white man in sandals and a Patagonia fleece, who nodded with practiced familiarity. Then she saw Malcolm. She hesitated. Her smile faded. Malcolm didn't miss it. He rarely missed anything. He stepped forward, slowly, like someone who had time to spare. Not to intimidate, just to exist fully in the space. "Good morning," he said, voice even and warm, holding out his phone. "Just confirming I'm in seat 1A. Brooke took the phone without smiling. Her fingers tapped once, then twice, a pause, then a blink. 1A, she repeated, skeptical. Malcolm nodded politely. "That's first class," she said, as though clarifying a complicated concept. He tilted his head. "Yes, ma'am." Another pause. She glanced down at his hoodie, his sneakers, the duffel. Her lips tightened. "Hold on 1 second," she said, and turned to whisper something behind the counter. From the side, a man approached, tall, clean cut, his uniform crisp and pressed. Connor Briggs, cabin supervisor. His badge gleamed beneath a Nova Air pin. Brooke gestured toward Malcolm without subtlety. "We've got a situation," she said under her breath. Connor followed her gaze. "Saw the hoodie," The sneakers. The skin. Then the boarding pass. That's first class, he asked, narrowing his eyes. That's what it says, Brooke replied. Connor straightened his posture and approached with a half smile. Sir, he began smoothly, do you mind if I take a quick look at your ID? Malcolm paused, then reached into his pocket and handed over his license. Connor checked the name, checked the phone. They matched. Still, he lingered. You know, Connor said with a practiced chuckle, these mobile passes can be tricky sometimes. Just want to make sure you didn't accidentally book the wrong section. I didn't, Malcolm replied gently. Connor's smile dimmed slightly. We're just trying to ensure the comfort and safety of all our premium passengers. Malcolm's eyebrow lifted. And I don't fit that profile. Connor hesitated. That's not what I said. But it's what you meant. Connor's throat tightened. If you'd be willing to wait until we finish boarding Group 1, we can double-check I'm not waiting, Malcolm said, voice calm but resolute. I booked 1A, window seat, first class. Brooke leaned in again. Her voice dropped, but the edge was sharper now. Mr. Avery, perhaps you misunderstood. Those seats are usually reserved for platinum members or business class frequent flyers. You may have selected economy comfort by mistake. A silence hung in the air like static. Malcolm looked at her, not angry, just tired. Then, without a word, he held up his boarding pass again, a quiet declaration. I have a confirmed first-class ticket, he said, softly. I'm not asking. I'm boarding. Connor exhaled a small laugh, nervously. Brooke stepped closer, her voice rising louder than necessary. That seat's not for you. The words echoed. Passengers nearby looked up. A woman gasped under her breath. A man lowered his phone. Tension rippled like a wave through the waiting area. Malcolm stared at Brooke. The same calm stillness, but something in his eyes shifted. Disappointment, deep, unmistakable, human. Brooke turned away, as if to reset the moment. Connor, she said curtly, escort him to economy. Now. Connor didn't move. Now, she repeated through clenched teeth. Connor finally nodded and extended a stiff arm. Right this way, sir. Malcolm didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, didn't say a thing. He walked, past the toddler now asleep on his mother's chest, past a businessman suddenly avoiding eye contact, past a teenage boy in a beanie, who quietly raised his phone and started recording. Malcolm lowered himself into a seat near the vending machines. The hum of fluorescent lights above buzzed slightly louder than before. A whisper from behind. That was uncomfortable. Yeah, but maybe it was a mistake, I mean. He didn't really look first class. Malcolm stared ahead. He heard it all, and chose silence. 5 minutes passed. Then came the call. We now invite our first-class passengers and Nova Elite members to begin boarding. Brooke's voice was cheery again, performative, unbothered. Connor flanked her with his perfect smile. They greeted polished shoes, tailored coats, and laughter with wide-eyed charm. They didn't glance Malcolm's way. Not once. The boarding line for Group 1 was thinning. The sound of suitcase wheels rolling over the patterned carpet mixed with idle chatter and the occasional beep of a boarding scan. Somewhere nearby, a barista called out a mispronounced name over the espresso machine's hiss. But Malcolm Avery stayed seated near the vending machines. His boarding pass rested on his thigh. The screen had gone dim, but he didn't wake it. He simply sat, still, processing. He was no stranger to tension. He'd sat across negotiating tables where billion-dollar stakes dangled in the silence. But this felt different. It wasn't a battle of leverage or legal terms. It was something more exhausting. It was something personal. A flight attendant passed by and offered a quick glance, then kept walking. Malcolm exhaled quietly, then leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and let his fingers lace together. He didn't feel humiliated. Not exactly. He felt watched. As if everything he'd worked for, everything he'd built, could be undone by one glance, one unchecked assumption, one voice saying, "That seat isn't for you." He shook the thought loose. Almost, from the corner of his eye, he saw the teenager in the beanie again, still holding his phone, still recording, this time not hiding it. Their eyes met. The young man nodded once, a question in his gaze. Malcolm nodded back, slowly. A moment later, the final call for boarding echoed across the speakers. Group 3 was welcomed. Then economy. People moved with mild urgency now. And just before the line disappeared, another figure approached the gate. A man in a graphite gray suit, clean-shaven, briefcase in hand. Elijah Rowe. Malcolm saw him before Brooke or Connor did. Elijah didn't speak to them. He simply scanned his ticket, nodded at the beep, and walked down the jet bridge. Malcolm's phone vibrated. A message from Elijah. Timeline moved up. Manhattan in 5 hours. Window needed before landing. Malcolm's lips curved slightly. He stood, picked up his duffel, and without breaking pace, walked toward the jet bridge. Brooke looked up just as he passed. Her mouth opened slightly, a delayed recognition flickering across her features. Connor was too busy smiling at a businessman in a golf vest to notice. Malcolm entered the plane. The first-class cabin glowed warmly. Leather seats, freshly wiped tray tables, passengers stowing laptops and sipping early cocktails. He didn't slow down, didn't blink. Seat 1A waited, still empty. He reached it. The woman in 1B glanced at him and then at the flight attendant nearby, clearly unsure. Malcolm placed his bag beneath the seat, then sat, back straight, eyes forward. The woman in 1B opened her mouth, closed it. Connor appeared seconds later. He moved faster than earlier, this time with a forced smile that cracked at the corners. "Sir, I think there's been a misunderstanding." Malcolm didn't turn. No misunderstanding. Connor hesitated. That seat was reassigned after you left the gate. To whom Connor blinked. "I'll have to check. I'll wait." The tone was calm, but it didn't budge. Brooke appeared at the cabin curtain. She froze for a second, then gathered herself and stepped forward. "Mr. Avery," she began, with a tone far more delicate than earlier. "We thought you had declined boarding." Malcolm looked at her. "I did not." Brooke shifted. "There was some confusion about your seating." "There was no confusion." Malcolm replied. "There was judgment, disguised as procedure." Neither of them responded. He let the pause stretch, just long enough to make it uncomfortable. "Where's your pilot?" Malcolm asked. Connor cleared his throat. "Captain Chase is preparing for departure. We don't typically disturb him unless I'm requesting him," Malcolm said simply, along with the cabin lead. "That's you, I believe, and your gate supervisor." Brooke paled slightly. "Sir, this is highly irregular. So is denying a confirmed first-class passenger their seat based on appearance." Brooke swallowed hard. Connor looked down briefly, then glanced toward the cockpit. Passengers in rows behind them leaned just slightly forward, pretending not to listen. Malcolm reached into his pocket, opened his phone, tapped something once. A small message appeared on the screen. "Elijah Rowe. Legal confirmation sent." He showed it briefly to Connor. "You have 90 seconds." Connor blinked, then turned. Brooke followed. The woman in 1B shifted again. "Excuse me," she whispered. "Are you someone important?" Malcolm didn't look at her. "No," he said. "I'm someone they thought wasn't." 3 minutes later, the cockpit door opened. Captain Ronell Chase emerged, stiff in posture, his pilot's cap tucked under one arm. He had the air of a man not used to being summoned. "Is there a threat or a disturbance?" he asked sharply. Malcolm didn't stand. He simply looked up. "No, there's a leadership concern." Captain Chase narrowed his eyes. "Excuse me." Malcolm held his gaze. "You were informed that a representative from Avery and Wells would be flying today. I was told a VP might be on board. No names were confirmed. I'm not a VP." Silence. Brooke glanced toward Connor. Connor didn't move. "I'm Malcolm Avery," he said. Captain Chase stiffened. The cabin became noticeably quieter. The whisper of air through the vents was suddenly louder than conversation. "I boarded today without staff, without cameras, without making my role known. To observe." He gestured gently toward Brooke and Connor. "I needed to see how your team treats people when they don't think they're being watched." Captain Chase glanced toward the curtain. "I think you've seen enough," he said tightly. "I have." Malcolm looked him in the eye. "And you've failed the test." Captain Ronald Chase did not appreciate surprises, especially not ones that happened before takeoff, in front of passengers, and certainly not involving the man who had just quietly revealed himself as the future owner of the airline he flew for. He stood stiffly near seat 1A, his jaw locked as if trying to prevent the wrong words from falling out. "Mr. Avery," he said slowly, "if you'd had concerns about service, this could have been escalated later, through the proper channels." Malcolm looked up at him without blinking. "And if I had, Captain, would I have received an honest answer or a polished one?" Ronell didn't respond. Brooke stood near the curtain, arms crossed tightly over her chest now. Her earlier confidence had faded. She looked smaller somehow. Connor stood just behind her, his arms at his sides. His face was red, not from embarrassment, but the uncomfortable heat of being caught. "I'm not here to make a scene," Malcolm said quietly. "I'm here because this was never about me alone." He leaned back into the seat slightly, gaze steady. "This was about the look on her face when she thought I didn't belong. The way you scanned my ID like you were looking for a flaw. The word situation you used at the gate, as if I was a problem to be handled." He turned toward Brooke. "And the smile you gave me wasn't a welcome. It was a warning." Brooke's lips parted, but nothing came out. Malcolm looked around at the nearby passengers. No one pretended not to be listening anymore. "You didn't shout. You didn't insult me directly. You followed the rules, just enough. But every gesture, every tone, every pause, whispered the same thing." He paused. "That I didn't belong in this seat." Connor stepped forward slightly. "Sir," I didn't mean Malcolm raised one hand, silencing him without a word. He pulled up the boarding pass on his phone again and held it up. This seat was paid for, like anyone else. No upgrade, no favor, no exception. He let that settle. Yet I was told to stand aside, to wait, to move back, to take less. Not because the seat wasn't mine, but because someone decided I didn't look like it should be. The tension in the cabin had turned electric. Captain Chase adjusted his posture. "Mr. Avery, I am responsible for the operations of this flight. If you'd like to submit a formal complaint, we will fully cooperate." Malcolm's voice remained calm. "You will." But it won't be as a complaint. It will be a record. He turned his eyes to Brooke again. I received 3 anonymous reports in the last 2 months about racial bias on Nova Air flights. He held up 3 fingers. 2 of them specifically mentioned this route, and 1 of them mentioned you by name. Brooke visibly recoiled. I came today to see if those stories were exaggerated. I had hoped they were. Connor's mouth opened slightly. We treat everyone equally, he offered weakly. Our procedures. What procedure? Malcolm asked softly. Tells you to double-check the ticket of a black man in a hoodie, but not the white man in cargo shorts who walked through before me. Connor froze. No answer came. Malcolm looked up at Captain Chase again. You're the senior authority on this flight. You set the tone for what's tolerated in your crew, and what's ignored. Chase shifted. I had no part in what happened at the gate. No, Malcolm said, but culture doesn't need your participation to exist. It needs your silence. He sat back slightly, resting his hands on his lap. I could have emailed, held a meeting, sent my assistant to speak to your board. He looked up once more, eyes clear, but that wouldn't have shown me what I saw today. That wouldn't have shown your passengers, or your staff, or the young man 3 rows back recording this whole thing. All eyes flicked toward Jaden, who sat motionless, phone in hand. Malcolm turned back to Chase. I didn't come here to punish anyone. I came here to see the truth, and I have. The cabin door opened briefly as a flight attendant slipped through, whispered something to Brooke, and backed away quickly. Connor rubbed his forehead. He looked younger now, like a boy realizing the teacher really had called his parents. Mr. Avery, Captain Chase said, voice more measured now. What do you intend to do next? Malcolm didn't speak for a moment. Then, slowly, he stood. He looked around the cabin at the curious faces, the guilty ones, and the quiet ones who understood without needing explanation. Then he turned to Brooke. You're relieved of duty, effective immediately. HR will follow up after landing. Brooke staggered back a step. Please, she said, voice cracking. I've been with this airline for over a decade. Then you should have known better. He turned to Connor. You're suspended pending investigation. You may remain on board to assist only in the back cabin. Connor didn't argue. And to Captain Chase. Malcolm said simply, you will remain in command of this flight, but your professional record is now under internal review. If we find this was part of a larger pattern, it won't be your final flight. Chase's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. Malcolm took a slow breath. I will return to my original seat. Not because I must, but because I want to remember what it felt like to be judged, and to remember why this change is necessary. He walked down the aisle again. This time, no one looked at him with doubt. Some looked away, ashamed. Others looked at him with something that felt like respect. A few nodded. Jaden lowered his phone as Malcolm approached row 22. You really are him, he said softly. Malcolm Avery. Malcolm sat down, leaned back into the seat, closed his eyes for a moment. I'm just a man, he whispered, who wanted to see the truth for himself. Outside the window, the rain had stopped, but a storm was just beginning to rise. The walk back to economy was longer than it had been the first time, not because the aisle changed length, but because now every eye followed him. There were no more glances pretending not to be glances, no more conversations acting as cover, just rows of passengers sitting still, watching the man they had once assumed didn't belong in first class take each step in complete silence. Malcolm Avery didn't rush. He didn't slouch or shrink. He walked the same way he'd led, with calm, with clarity, with weight, in every movement. When he reached row 22, he paused. The seat beside the window still held his earlier presence, a slight wrinkle in the cushion where he had been, his leather duffel still resting below. Jaden Ortiz looked up from his phone, eyes wide with a kind of awe that was quiet and young. "You came back," Jaden said softly. Malcolm lowered himself into the seat. One deliberate motion. Back straight. "Breathing even, I said I would," he replied. Jaden hesitated, then whispered, "You could have stayed up there. Nobody would have questioned it." Now Malcolm turned to him, and in that brief moment Jaden saw something unexpected. Not anger, not pride, but weariness, like a man who had been carrying a weight most couldn't see. "That's the problem," Malcolm said gently. "They would have seen me there and thought the story was over, but it's not." He leaned back against the window, folded his hands in his lap. "The story ends here, in this seat. Not because I was denied first class, but because I chose not to keep it." Jaden looked down at his phone. Still recording, then hit stop. He wasn't sure why. It just felt right. He tucked the phone into his sweatshirt pocket and looked forward. The plane began to taxi outside. The tarmac shimmered with the soft remains of the morning rain. The engines hummed to life, and the runway stretched ahead like a path not yet taken. For a few minutes there was nothing but motion, wheels against concrete, the soft murmur of announcements, the occasional click of a seatbelt buckle. But inside row 22, Malcolm's mind was anything but quiet. He stared at the back of the seat in front of him, unmoving. But within him thoughts moved in every direction. He remembered the early days of Avery and Wells, when meetings took place in coffee shops and borrowed boardrooms, when venture capitalists smiled at his ideas, but never called back. He remembered being the only black man in rooms where power passed between hands like currency, where his silence was seen as compliance and his confidence mistaken for arrogance. He remembered the long hours, the nights alone, the fear that maybe no amount of brilliance could overcome the barriers that weren't spoken, but still stood tall. And now, even with ownership, papers signed, even with financial control of a legacy airline, even with quiet authority wrapped around him like armor, they still saw the hoodie first. He closed his eyes, let his breath slow. Jaden sat beside him, still respectful but curious. "Sir," he asked carefully, "can I ask you something?" Malcolm opened his eyes. "Of course. Were you angry? Like really angry?" "When they stopped you at the gate." Malcolm considered it, then gave a small nod. "Yes," he said, "but not in the way people expect." He turned slightly toward Jaden. "Anger is easy. It rises fast. It burns hot, and then it's gone. But what I felt was older, deeper." He paused, fingers tracing the edge of the armrest. "It was the kind of anger that comes from being told over and over in 1,000 quiet ways that you don't belong. The kind of anger you learn to carry, not to fight with, but to navigate around, to protect your peace." Jaden nodded slowly. "So why didn't you yell?" he asked. "Why not just shut it all down at the gate?" "Because then," Malcolm replied, "that's all they would have seen. A man yelling, a disruption. Another incident. He looked forward again, but when you say nothing, when you let the system expose itself, that's when people start asking the right questions." Jaden leaned back in his seat thoughtful. "You didn't just come here to fly, did you?" Malcolm smiled faintly. "No," he said. "I came to watch." The seatbelt sign dinged above, and the nose of the plane lifted gently from the ground. Atlanta slowly fell away beneath them, a grid of roads and rooftops, of stories unfolding unseen. Malcolm turned to the window, watched as the clouds embraced them, and whispered to no one in particular. "The sky doesn't care what seat you're in. Only people do." The cabin settled into that strange quiet that comes after takeoff. a mix of engine hum and unspoken thoughts. In row 22, Jaden closed his eyes, trying to imagine what kind of man would give up power in public just to prove a private truth. And beside him, Malcolm sat in silence, already thinking ahead about what he would say. Not to the press, not to the public, but to the boardrooms that forgot where dignity begins and who deserves it. The flight continued toward New York, but the real destination was already clear. It was never about where he was going. It was about what he had already left behind. Flight 932 had been in the air for just over 20 minutes, cruising at 35,000 feet. The hum of altitude wrapped the cabin like a warm, low blanket. In row 22, Malcolm Avery sat still, his fingers pressed lightly together, gaze fixed on nothing in particular. His mind, however, was far from idle. He was thinking about the meetings awaiting him in Manhattan, the acquisition documents resting on encrypted drives, the names of department heads who would soon report to him, not out of fear, but out of realignment. But more than that, he was thinking about silence, about how many times people had stood exactly where he stood this morning, with no power, no title, no camera phone catching the moment, just the sting of doubt in a stranger's voice, and nowhere to put it behind him. A flight attendant passed quietly through the aisle, offering water and smiles that looked more like shields. She paused at their row, nodded politely, offered a paper cup with a lemon wedge floating inside. Malcolm accepted it with a quiet thank you. Her eyes lingered a little longer. Then she moved on. Jaden Ortiz watched her go, then leaned closer to Malcolm. "You think it's always been this way?" he asked. Malcolm took a sip of the water, then looked out of the window. "No," he said. "It hasn't always been this quiet. Sometimes it screamed. Sometimes it wore a badge, or burned a cross, or built a sign that said whites only. But now it wears a smile, a uniform, a corporate policy." He turned toward Jaden. Same message, different language? Jaden nodded slowly, chewing on the words. Then the overhead light dinged softly. A subtle shift in energy flowed through the cabin. Elijah Rose stepped out from the first-class curtain, walked back with the casual confidence of someone who never needed to explain his presence. He stopped at row 22 and leaned forward. "We've got an update," he said under his breath. "Manhattan meetings moved up. They want to confirm statement language before we land." Malcolm raised one eyebrow. "They already sent the statement. They're working on drafts. Legal wants a quick alignment. Media's circling the story already. Reddit's running a thread. There's a copy of the footage online now. Over 12,000 views. In 15 minutes. Malcolm didn't respond immediately. He glanced past Elijah, through the aisle up toward the front, where first class now sat in carefully maintained silence. "Does it show the whole thing?" he asked. Jaden answered first. "Not all of it, but enough you, the gate their tone." Elijah nodded in agreement. Malcolm looked down for a moment, then stood. It wasn't loud. It wasn't performative. He simply rose, like a man returning to something that had always belonged to him. Passengers turned their heads one by one, as if summoned by instinct. He walked the aisle slowly, Elijah beside him. Jaden didn't move, just watched. As Malcolm reached the front of the economy cabin, Connor Briggs looked up from where he had been restocking the beverage cart. His eyes widened. He froze for a beat too long. Malcolm passed through the curtain again, stepping into the first-class cabin with a presence that could not be ignored. Brooke Halter was gone, already removed as instructed. A new flight attendant stood at the front, nervous young, clutching a clipboard as if it could shield her from whatever this was. Malcolm offered her a kind smile, then turned toward Sate. Still empty. The passenger in 1B startled as he approached. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then thought better of it. Malcolm placed his duffel under the seat, sat down, breathed. The air was different here. Not cleaner, just more watched. A minute later, Connor appeared at the front curtain. He hesitated, then approached. "Sir," began, his voice tight. "I apologize for the confusion earlier." Malcolm looked at him calmly. "You mean the confusion where you doubted the legitimacy of my seat, or the confusion where you quietly reinforced someone else's bias?" Connor swallowed. "Sir, I was just following." Malcolm raised a hand, stopping him without a word, not out of rudeness, but because he had no more time for rehearsed excuses. Captain Ronald Chase stepped out from the cockpit again, his posture more reserved now. The bravado from earlier had faded. "Mr. Avery," he said, "we're doing everything we can to accommodate you now." Malcolm looked up. "It's not about accommodating me," he said. "It's about acknowledging what happened and correcting the system that allowed it." Captain Chase nodded slowly. Not in agreement, but in admission. Malcolm turned toward the small galley space. To the anxious eyes of crew members lingering nearby, he spoke clearly, not loudly, but with purpose. "What happened today has already left this plane. People have seen it, heard it, felt it. The question now isn't whether you're sorry, it's whether you'll change." He let the words land, then leaned back in his seat, folded his hands. "You may resume service." No one moved right away. Then gradually they did. Connor backed away. Flight attendants returned to their duties. The cabin began to breathe again, and Malcolm Avery, in seat 1A, closed his eyes, not in triumph, but in steady resolve. The next phase had already begun. 36,000 feet in the air, and yet the cabin had never felt heavier. Not because of the altitude, but because of what had just occurred, and what could no longer be ignored. Connor Briggs stood by the galley. Quiet now, his crisp uniform no longer carried authority. Just wait. He looked around the cabin at the passengers who were pretending to read, pretending to sleep, pretending they hadn't just witnessed the most powerful man on this flight. Be reminded that power doesn't always walk in with a suit. He reached for the clipboard, then stopped. There was nothing left to write that would fix what had already been documented by every passenger with a phone, and by the one man who hadn't needed to raise his voice to shift the ground beneath them. In seat 1A, Malcolm Avery sat still, his posture relaxed, but his presence filled every inch of space. He wasn't thinking about policy memos or lawsuits, or the optics of a viral video. He was thinking about responsibility. Not just the responsibility of owning a company, but of carrying the burden of being the one who had to prove again that his presence wasn't a mistake. Across from him, the woman in 1B sipped from her glass of wine without saying a word, but her eyes kept drifting. Small glances, each one holding a new kind of curiosity. After a while, she spoke. "You handled that with a lot of grace," she said. Malcolm looked over gently. "Thank you," he said. "Grace was the only thing I had that couldn't be questioned." She nodded, looked down at her hands, then back at him. "I have a son," she said quietly. "He's 12, loves space science. NASA, the whole thing." Malcolm smiled softly. "Sounds like a bright kid." She hesitated, then continued. "When he saw a black astronaut in a textbook last year, he cried. Not because it was inspiring, but because he thought it meant he had permission to dream." That big Malcolm's expression softened. "Permission," he repeated. She nodded. "And then this morning I watched them doubt you, and I realized that even adults don't always get that permission." Malcolm looked out the window again. The clouds below stretched wide like an ocean of silence. He didn't respond right away. Then he said, "That's why I came on this flight. Not to be seen, but to see how much has really changed, and how much we're still pretending has further down the aisle." Elijah Rowe stood beside the lavatory, phone in hand, reading a stream of notifications. He tapped the screen, spoke into his AirPod, kept his voice low. Yes, he's in 1A. No, he hasn't addressed the media. Yes, the footage is real. We've confirmed the source. He paused. He's not playing it for PR, he's playing it for purpose. That's the difference. From the cockpit, Captain Ronell Chase sat rigid in his seat. His hand hovered over the intercom, then pulled away. His co-pilot looked over, raised an eyebrow. You all right? Chase gave a curt nod. I'll be fine. But he wasn't. He kept replaying the moment. Malcolm said, You're the senior authority. And you said nothing. That line hit harder than any reprimand. Because it was true. He had said nothing, done nothing, not at the gate. Not when Connor hesitated, not when Brooke spoke those words with certainty. That seat's not for you, he hadn't spoken. And silence is not neutrality. Silence is complicity. Worn like a second skin. He stared out at the horizon, where blue met endless blue, and wondered how many others had passed through his flights. Felt the same quiet, rejection, but left with nothing more than an ache they couldn't name. In the cabin, Jaden Ortiz opened his phone again. The video was spreading. Now over 100,000 views, hashtags multiplying, comments rolling in faster than he could read. But what caught his attention was the message in his inbox. Someone had sent him a note. Keep recording. These moments matter. Anonymous. He looked around, wondered who had sent it, then locked his screen and whispered to himself, This isn't just a flight anymore. In seat 1A. Malcolm closed his eyes. He could feel the change in air pressure, not just from the altitude, but from something else, something shifting. This wasn't about one seat, or one man, or one policy. It was about the hidden machinery behind every polite smile, every mispronounced assumption, every smile that meant no. He thought of his mother, who had worked 3 jobs, never flown on a plane, but always told him, You walk in like you paid for the ground. You're standing on, he had walked onto this flight that way, and still, they tried to tell him he didn't belong. He opened his eyes slowly and saw the cabin differently, not as a passenger, not as an executive, but as a mirror, every face, every silence, every reaction. It all reflected something deeper, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel disappointed. He felt ready, ready for whatever came next, ready to speak, not for himself, but for everyone who had ever been told quietly, You are less, because that shift in air pressure. It wasn't turbulence. It was transformation. The flight was halfway to New York, but no one on board could tell you the distance. Because the real gap wasn't measured in miles. It was measured in perception, in assumptions, in the space between who someone is and who they're believed to be. And today, that space had closed. Malcolm Avery remained in seat 1, elbows resting on the armrests, eyes steady, calm, composed. He had become something unusual on a plane. Stillness. Not the frozen kind that comes from fear, but the kind rooted in certainty, the kind that says, I am no longer waiting for permission. Across the aisle. The woman in 1B was silent, her posture straighter than it had been when she boarded. As if sharing space with Malcolm shifted her own expectations too. The murmurs had faded. No one dared to speak loudly. Even the sound of tray tables opening felt like an interruption. Connor Briggs re-entered the front cabin. He was carrying a tablet now, trying to look busy, trying not to feel exposed. Malcolm glanced at him. Just once. That was enough. Connor turned his eyes away. Captain Ronald Chase had remained in the cockpit. His voice hadn't come over the intercom since takeoff. But every flight attendant knew something unspoken had changed. The kind of change that doesn't get reset when the seatbelt sign turns off. From the back of the cabin, Elijah Rowe stepped through the curtain again. He didn't say anything. He just placed a folded slip of paper on the tray in front of Malcolm, then stepped away. Malcolm opened it. 4 handwritten words. Clear, precise media waiting at gate. He nodded once, then folded the note and tucked it into the pocket of his jacket. He wasn't surprised. He knew the video had been uploaded. He knew the views were multiplying. He knew hashtags had begun forming before the plane had even reached cruising altitude. But he didn't come here for media. He came for accountability. He turned to the flight attendant who had replaced Brooke, a young woman named Shay Nervous. But trying, "Excuse me," Malcolm said gently. "Would you mind asking Captain Chase to step out one more time?" Shay hesitated, then nodded and disappeared into the cockpit. Seconds later, Captain Chase emerged again, his uniform still immaculate, but his face betrayed the exhaustion beneath it. "Yes, Mr. Avery," he said carefully. Malcolm looked up at him. "Do you know what a seat represents?" The question caught the captain off guard. "Sir, a seat," Malcolm repeated. "It's not just leather and space. It's a signal. It tells people where they stand, what they've earned, what they're worth." "Captain," Chase didn't answer. "When you denied me that seat," Malcolm said, "you didn't just question a boarding pass. You questioned whether I had the right to exist in a space you had already decided wasn't mine." Chase's throat tightened. "That seat was paid for," Malcolm continued. "It didn't come from privilege, or a favor, or a last-minute bump. It came from the same work, the same struggle, the same discipline. As every other ticket in this cabin," he held up his phone, opened the email confirmation, held it out like evidence in court. "But you still saw something different," he said. "You saw a black man in a hoodie, and everything you thought you knew filled in the rest." "Captain." Chase nodded slowly, a small gesture, but heavy with implication. Malcolm wasn't finished. "You didn't yell. You didn't curse. You didn't use slurs. You just asked questions, unnecessary ones." In a tone that said you already had the answer and that he paused. "Is how it happens now, not with fire hoses, but with clipboard smiles and lowered voices." The cabin was completely silent. Even the children weren't stirring. "This isn't the first time," Malcolm said, "but it will be the last time it happens without consequence." He tapped the screen of his phone again, showed Chase the press email waiting in his outbox. "The incident has been documented." He said, "The culture will be reviewed. The consequences are already unfolding." Captain Chase didn't argue. He just stood there, not in resistance, but in reckoning. Then Malcolm lowered his voice. "And if you ever wonder why this matters, ask yourself one question. What if I hadn't been the CEO? What if I had just been a father taking his child on their first flight? Or a nurse returning from a double shift? Or a student with one clean shirt and a dream? Would you have spoken the same way? Or worse?" Captain Chase nodded once, his jaw tight, then turned and walked slowly back to the cockpit, not in shame, but in thought. The weight of the truth, even when quiet, is undeniable. Malcolm leaned back in his seat. He looked out the window again. New York was just an hour away, but something had already landed. Not the flight. The message. 30,000 feet above the world. And yet the real altitude was measured in the space between one truth and 1,000 versions of it. In row 22. Jaden Ortiz sat quietly, phone in hand, eyes flicking between the home screen and the video he had recorded earlier that morning. He hadn't uploaded it yet, not the full version. Not until now. He adjusted his seat, took a slow breath, and with a final glance around the cabin, tapped post. The file began to upload. The thumbnail showed a still frame of Malcolm Avery, standing at gate, Psi 12, holding his boarding pass, calm framed by silence, misjudged in real time. Jaden added no music, no edits, no hashtags, just one title, 5 words. This seat was paid for. The signal was weak, but the upload bar crawled forward. 10%. 2035. Jaden leaned back, heart ticking louder than the engines. Not because he feared attention, but because he understood something. Sometimes silence needs a witness. And sometimes the story doesn't belong to the person living it. It belongs to everyone who's been there beside him. In first class, Malcolm Avery was unaware. Or maybe he wasn't. Maybe he knew exactly what was coming. 47%, then 62. Back in the cockpit, Captain Ronell Chase stared at the flight dashboard. But his mind wasn't there. It was still in 1A. Still circling the sentence that Malcolm had delivered like a quiet verdict. What if I hadn't been the CEO? He had replayed it again and again, trying to imagine a different answer, but none came, and that he knew was the problem. Elijah Rowe's phone buzzed. In the crew galley. He opened a secure browser, scrolled once, then stopped. The video had posted. He watched the view count climb as if it had momentum. 4,000, 7,012. It was being reposted by accounts that mattered, not just activists, but airline insiders, civil rights lawyers, former employees who had stayed silent too long at minute 1. The comments started at minute 3. It hit trending, Malcolm's words low and clear, carried over headphone speakers, echoed off coffee shop walls, whispered through office break rooms. I didn't raise my voice because the system spoke loud enough without mine. In first class, Shay, the flight attendant, stepped closer to 1A, Mr. Avery. She said gently, "You might want to know. Your name is everywhere." Malcolm looked up, not surprised, only reflective. He took the tablet she offered, scrolled once. Then again. The thumbnail stared back at him. That moment, that breath frozen. He handed the tablet back without comment. Then leaned forward, palms pressed together. He had not sought exposure, but he knew the power of it. He had not asked for a headline, but he had written one with every measured step. The woman in 1B leaned closer. "You're him," she said, not as a question, but as a recognition. Malcolm met her eyes, offered a nod. Not of pride, but of acknowledgement. "What are you going to say?" she asked. "When they ask you to explain it all." Malcolm looked out the window. Nothing, he said. They already said enough. Down in the economy cabin, Jaden refreshed his phone again. It had hit 30,000, then 40, then 52. He scrolled through the comments. One caught his eye. "I work for an airline. I've seen this happen, and I'm ashamed. I never spoke up." Oh, another, "This man just showed us how to dismantle a system with stillness." And another, "This is what quiet power looks like." Jaden sat back, eyes wet, not from sadness, but from something harder to name. Recognition, gratitude, hope in the Nova air. Manhattan headquarters. The executive conference room was chaos. Screens displayed news feeds, a Twitter timeline moving too fast to read, phones ringing PR teams scrambling for statements that didn't sound empty. Randall Shore, Nova Air's CEO, stood at the head of the table. Watching the footage for the second time, he rubbed his temples, looked toward Tasha Flynn from HR. "Was this the same flight we flagged 2 weeks ago?" he asked Tasha. Nodded, face pale. The one with 2 unresolved complaints. One was racial. One was conduct. He turned to the general counsel. "Did you know Avery and Wells had eyes on this flight?" Legal shook their head. "We were told they were weeks away from on-site presence." Randall paced the room, his voice rising. "This isn't just bad optics. This is ownership optics. They were watching us, and we failed the test." He stopped mid-stride. "No, we didn't just fail. We proved the reports right." Silence in the room. Then a junior executive whispered, "Do you think this was deliberate?" Randall didn't answer, because he already knew. Of course it was. Malcolm Avery didn't move without purpose. He didn't make noise. He made impact. And now they weren't just negotiating with a buyer. They were answering to a mirror. Back on Flight 932. Malcolm closed his eyes, the hum of the cabin returning to rhythm, the world watching. But for the first time in a long time, he felt light. Not because the weight was gone, but because he knew he was no longer carrying it alone. The video was out. The story was real, and the whisper that started at Gate C-12 had become a roar. The Nova Air executive floor was quiet. Too quiet for a company that prided itself on movement. Phones still rang, keyboards still clicked. But underneath it all, there was a pressure in the walls. The kind that builds when truth can no longer be delayed. Randall Shore stood with both hands braced against the head of the long conference table. His reflection stared back at him from the polished, woodjaw clenched eyes shadowed. Behind him, a wall of glass revealed a hazy Manhattan skyline. But no one in the room was looking out. They were all staring in. The viral video had crossed 1 million views, a clip less than 5 minutes long, but long enough to show what polished mission statements had failed to hide. Malcolm Avery boarding pass in hand, dressed like no one worth noticing, treated like no one worth respecting. And then, the shift, the reveal, the reckoning, the silence of professionals realizing they had profiled the man buying their entire company. Randall exhaled slowly, then turned to face the room. "Where are we on the official statement?" He asked Elijah Rowe, already issued his brief. Said a full press conference would follow upon landing. Legal has advised us not to preempt him. Tasha Flynn's voice was low measured. We're too late anyway. The story's not ours to tell anymore. Randall tapped the table with 2 fingers. A nervous rhythm. How many incidents have... We flagged internally. This year, 26. Tasha replied without looking down. Of those 15 are unresolved. 9 involved complaints about discriminatory treatment on the ground. And this flight, Randall asked specifically, 2 red flags. Tasha nodded, one naming the gate, one naming the lead agent by name, Brooke Halter. She's already been relieved of duty. Elijah's team handled it directly midair. Randall sat down slowly, like a man realizing his legs might no longer support him. We knew, he said quietly. We didn't act, but we knew. No one corrected him. Across the table, the communications director shifted nervously. Public sentiment is turning fast. Some are calling for a boycott. Others are asking for a full audit of our hiring and training practices. And Malcolm Randall asked, what's he said publicly? Nothing. Not a tweet, not a quote, not a statement, just silence. The legal counsel leaned in, which makes it worse, because it forces everyone to sit with what they saw. No spin, no interpretation. Just 5 minutes of uncomfortable truth. Randall looked toward the head of the table, the chair where he usually sat today. He hadn't dared to. He turned to Tasha. Do we have a clear path forward? Yes. But it starts with accountability, she said firmly. And you know what that means. Randall looked down, then slowly nodded. You'll have my resignation by end of day. He said. The room went still. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't noble. It was overdue. Tasha stood, slid a folder across the table. This outlines the transition plan Avery and Wells proposed during Phase 2 of the acquisition. They were planning for a gradual shift, but that window's closed. Randall opened the folder. Inside were 3 simple words at the top of the page: Leadership Realignment Framework. Malcolm's signature was at the bottom. So this was the plan all along, Randall murmured. He came to test the culture, not just the numbers. Tasha nodded. He didn't want to inherit a broken machine. He wanted to see if we even knew it was broken. Across the city. At JFK International Flight 932 had just touched down. The tires kissed the runway. A puff of rubber smoke trailing behind inside the cabin. Passengers stirred, Seat belts clicked. Phones lit up with signals and alerts. Malcolm Avery remained seated in 1A calm unmoved. Jaden Ortiz looked back from row 22, eyes meeting Malcolm's, just for a second. A silent thank you passing between them. The cabin doors opened. Malcolm was the last to stand. Not because he needed to, but because he chose to. A flight attendant opened the curtain. He stepped through. Elijah was waiting just outside the jet bridge, phone in hand. Gray suit, crisp expression, unreadable. "We've landed," Elijah said. "Yes," Malcolm replied. "We have news." Cameras were waiting near baggage claim. Producers holding clipboards. Reporters fixing their microphones. Malcolm adjusted his jacket. "I won't be giving a statement today." He said Elijah didn't. "Question it." The video spoke loud enough, and the silence afterward said even more. They exited the terminal quietly. No entourage, no spotlight, just presence. The kind that forces institutions to take a long, hard look at themselves. 3 days later. The Nova Air employee portal looked different, not in color or layout, but in tone. The banner no longer read, "Soaring Together." It had been replaced with something simpler. More honest change begins here. Inside every department, from ticketing desks to in-flight services. The video of Malcolm Avery had become more than a viral clip. It had become a mirror, a training module, a conversation starter, a reckoning. At first, employees shared it in whispers. "Have you seen it?" He was on that flight. They denied him 1A. But over time, the tone shifted. Not just surprise, but reflection. Because everyone had seen it happen. In one form or another, the passenger someone assumed couldn't afford the seat. The woman mistaken for staff. The father who had to explain to his son why someone asked, "Are you sure you belong here?" Now those moments weren't brushed off. They were written down, reported, brought into the light. At Nova Air headquarters, Tasha Flynn stood before a room of regional managers. Her sleeves rolled up, her voice steady. "We're not doing performative resets," she said. "No hashtag campaigns, no empty promises. We are rewriting how we lead." She clicked the remote. A slide appeared, 3 faces side by side. Brooke Halter, Connor Briggs, Captain, Ronald Chase. "These are not villains," Tasha said. "They are examples of how unchecked bias hides behind professionalism, of how procedure can become a shield for judgment, of how leadership starts with accountability." She advanced to the next slide. This time, a list of changes. Revised boarding procedures. Bias training led by third-party civil rights educators. Anonymous feedback lines connected directly to executive review. Diverse hiring panels for frontline roles. And one final point, rotational flight audits. They won't know when or where or who, but someone from executive oversight. Maybe even Mr. Avery himself will be flying alone. Unannounced, because leadership is not what you show when the cameras are rolling. It's what you reveal when no one's watching. The managers were quiet. Some scribbled notes. Others simply nodded, but no one pushed back. The ground had already shifted elsewhere. At a mid-size airport in Ohio, Connor Briggs sat in a training room. He wore no name badge, no uniform, just a gray polo and jeans. His suspension had ended, but his return came with a condition. Reflection, retraining, re-entry. He sat at the edge of a semicircle among a group of newer hires, listening to a guest speaker from a civil rights organization talk about implicit bias. At first, Connor had crossed his arms, offended, defensive. But as the session went on, he found himself staring at the floor, remembering not just what he had said, but how he had said it, the tone, the hesitation, the smile that wasn't really a smile. He had meant well, he thought, but good intentions, unquestioned, still cause harm. During a break, he stepped outside, pulled out his phone, typed a message. "Mr. Avery, this is Connor. I don't expect a reply, but I need to say this. I saw myself in that video. Not just my face, but my silence. I was professional, but I wasn't kind, and I didn't see it until I was forced to. Thank you for letting the world see what I couldn't." He hit send, then sat on the bench, eyes closed. Meanwhile, in another city, Brooke Halter sat behind a desk at a small regional carrier. Her name tag read, "Training Consultant." The irony was not lost on her. She had applied for the job 2 weeks after her termination, expecting silence, maybe rejection, but the offer came. Conditional. She would not be rehired at Nova Air, but she could help somewhere smaller, somewhere still learning. She hesitated at first, then accepted. Not because she wanted redemption, but because the silence from her former colleagues hurt more than the firing. No one had defended her, not even the ones who used to laugh at the same assumptions. In her new role, she led onboarding sessions, walked trainees through the importance of language, tone, presence. One day, she opened the training slide and saw Malcolm Avery's name. At the bottom of a quote, "Dignity is not earned, it is owed to everyone." She paused, read it twice. Then for the first time in weeks spoke without bitterness. "He taught us something," she said quietly, and I ignored it, until I couldn't anymore. At Avery and Wells, Malcolm sat in his office. Overlooking the East River, he held Connor's message in his hand. Read it once. Then again. He didn't reply immediately. He let it sit, because growth, real growth, doesn't come from being corrected. It comes from seeing yourself clearly. Finally, he typed Connor. "You weren't the only one who learned something on that flight. And the truth is, this system failed us both, in different ways. You're not fired. You're seen. But what you choose to do now, that's yours to own. Stay curious, stay honest. Malcolm." He hit send, then leaned back in his chair. The skyline outside shimmered with late afternoon light, and for the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel like something to control. It felt like something to shape. Together. There's a particular kind of silence in airport terminals at night. It's not the absence of sound, but the soft hum of exhaustion, people waiting to leave, or waiting to return, at Gate D5 in San Diego. A woman in a blue vest tapped her badge against the scanner, logged into the check-in kiosk, and glanced at the line forming. One passenger caught her attention. A teenage boy, hoodie backpack, slung low, boarding pass in hand. He stepped forward, spoke with quiet confidence. "Hi, just confirming. Seat 1A. She scanned it, then looked up at him. "For just?" A second too long, and then she smiled. "Yes, sir. You're all set. Welcome aboard." He blinked as if surprised. Not at the seat, but at the absence of hesitation. Behind the counter, another agent leaned toward her. "That's Malcolm Avery's seat," she whispered. The woman smiled. "Not anymore. Now it belongs to anyone who deserves it." Across the country in New York, Malcolm sat in his office. Late light spilling across the table. In front of him, a stack of letters, printed emails, handwritten notes, messages from strangers, from passengers, from crew. He picked one up. Read it slowly. "Mr. Avery. I watched that video from row 22 at least 10 times. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was familiar. I'm not black, but I've been invisible in boardrooms. Overlooked at gates, dismissed by titles I hadn't earned yet. You reminded me that power doesn't need to shout. It just needs to stand still and let the silence expose everything. Thank you, Lena M." He folded the letter, placed it back into the envelope, picked up another, "Malcolm. I was on that flight. I didn't say anything. I just watched. And that's what I regret most. Not the discomfort, but the silence. I should have spoken. I should have asked why you were pulled aside. I should have looked Brooke in the eye and said, "This doesn't feel right, I didn't. But I will." Next time, mark D. The next was scribbled on lined notebook paper, folded 3 times, smudged at the edges. Mr. Avery, my name is Malik. I'm 12. I saw your story on YouTube. My mom showed me. She said you didn't yell, even when they treated you bad. She said you let them show who they were. Then you showed them who you were. I want to be like that. When people think I can't do something, I want to be calm, but strong. My mom says that's real power. I think so too. Thank you. From Malek C. Malcolm closed his eyes for a moment. Let the letter sit in his hands. This was why he had done it. Not for the headlines, not for the meetings, but for moments like this. For 12-year-old boys learning what dignity looks like. For strangers who had watched in silence, but were now finding their voices. He looked to the final envelope in the pile. No return address typed neat. He opened it slowly. Mr. Avery. You don't know me, but I knew Brooke. We worked together for years. She wasn't perfect. None of us are, but I never thought she'd be part of something like that. When the news broke, everyone pretended they didn't know her, didn't laugh at the same jokes, didn't ignore the same complaints. But we all did, and when she disappeared, so did the conversation. No one wanted to talk about what made that moment possible. We just wanted to forget, but you didn't let us, and I think we're better for it. She's working again. Different company, different role. I hear she's changed, not perfectly, but meaningfully. That's what real consequences should lead to, not shame but clarity. Thank you for giving us that no name, no signature, just truth. Malcolm leaned back. The room was quiet, the city pulsing beyond the windows. He didn't need a response to every letter, just the knowing that each one meant someone saw what needed to be seen. He pulled out his notebook, wrote a single sentence at the top of a blank page. Change begins in row 22. But it doesn't end there. He underlined it, twice, then sat back, let the weight of it all settle in his chest. In the hallway, Elijah stepped in. You ready for tomorrow? He asked. Malcolm nodded. What's the room look like? Sold out. Press students leaders. Some from Nova Air too. Good, Malcolm replied. They should hear this in person. Elijah walked over, saw the stack of letters. He picked one up, read a line, then placed it gently back down. You ever think about how far this reached? He asked. Malcolm looked out at the city. Think about how far it still has to go. Elijah smiled. That's why it started with you. Malcolm didn't answer right away. Then finally, no, it didn't start with me. It started with every person they ever told. This seat isn't for you, I just happened to sit down and stay. A year later, Atlanta Hartsfield's Terminal 4 felt different. Not because the rain had stopped, but because the air was lighter, full of possibility. At Gate C12, a young man approached the counter, jeans hoodie, a leather backpack slung casually over one shoulder. He held a first-class boarding pass. Site 1A. Brooke Halter was behind the desk now, no longer the gate agent who once questioned a man's right to his seat, but a woman transformed by experience. She looked up, saw the boarding pass, saw the name, and smiled warmly. Welcome aboard, sir. Seat 1A is ready for you. The young man blinked, not at the kindness, but at the absence of hesitation. Behind Brooke, a colleague whispered softly, That's Malcolm Avery's seat. She nodded. Not anymore. It belongs to everyone who deserves it. The man smiled, thanked her quietly, and walked through the gate, down the jet bridge. The woman from row 1B on the flight, Malcolm had taken a year before, stood her eyes bright, her posture confident. She whispered to a flight attendant, He earned it. We all do. Malcolm Avery sat alone in his office. High above the East River, a city buzzing with life and stories. He sipped tea, let the quiet settle around him. Elijah Rowe entered quietly, documents in hand. The new pay scale has been approved, and the internal review process is saving us money on lawsuits. Malcolm nodded, barely looking up. Anything else? Elijah hesitated. There's a message from a passenger last week. Saw you in seat 12B. She was too nervous to say hi. Wrote that she saw you helping a mom traveling alone with a baby. You didn't do it to be seen. You just did. Thank you. Malcolm smiled softly. For a man who doesn't like speeches, you've made a hell of a statement. He chuckled quietly. I didn't need to speak, he said. They said enough. Outside the window, the city pulsed with light and movement. Stories crossing beneath the skyline, lives intertwined, and somewhere in the quiet moments, a young black man in a hoodie sat in seat 1A. Not because he was told he belonged, but because he knew he did. Malcolm Avery's story is a reminder that dignity isn't a privilege. It's a right owed to everyone, regardless of who they are or what they wear. His calm strength showed us that true power often speaks in silence, revealing injustice that too many try to ignore. But this is more than just a story about one flight or one man. It's a call to action for all of us, to recognize the quiet ways discrimination still seeps into everyday life, to challenge assumptions, to listen, and to create spaces where respect is the default, not the exception. If this story moved you, remember it's only the beginning. Together, we can shine a light on these truths and inspire real change. One conversation, one moment at a time. Thank you for watching. If you want to support this channel and help spread stories that matter, please like, share, and subscribe. Don't miss our next videos, where we continue exploring stories of courage, justice, and humanity. Because every voice deserves to be heard, and every seat belongs to someone worthy.